What is up guys, Blue Spooky here with another 2-hour Megamix. If you guys are enjoying these daily uploads and these longer 2-hour videos, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you end up enjoying this one. If we could aim for 1,500 likes on these longer videos, that would be a good milestone to aim for. It all helps the channel to grow and the videos to do well, to ensure I can keep doing these for a long time to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below, as my favorite part about doing these is reading your guys' thoughts. Without further ado, I will let you enjoy the next 2 hours or so of true scary stories, and I hope you guys have a great day. I'll see you again at the end of the video. About a year ago, when I became single for the first time in years, I was very reluctant to get back into the dating scene. I felt tired of the very thought of dating, honestly, and getting back out there, as they always say. A friend of mine suggested I just check out Tinder. At first, it was an easy pass for me. I know what kind of men are on there, and I definitely was not looking for that. However, I did let the idea marinate for a little while. I discovered that one of my coworkers who I'd become close friends with had actually found her husband on Tinder, and she told me that not everyone on there was gross. You just needed to take some chances, and eventually you'd find a nice guy. I created a Tinder account and added some cute pics, and waited until I got some hits on my profile. After a while, I did. Quite a few, actually. Most of the guys were either pigs or were as boring as watching paint dry. Just as I was about to call it quits on this dating app, I got a match with a guy named Ron. He was a very good-looking guy, and from what I could tell in his pictures, he seemed tall and very in shape. Some of the pictures on his profile were of some basketball things, so I was able to see his height compared to others around him. He had shoulder-length brown hair and a very vibrant smile, honestly his best attribute. After we matched, he messaged me not long after. We made some small talk for a little while, and the conversation evolved. Before I knew it, I had been messaging this guy for a few hours now. He finally asked me for my number, and asked if we could go grab a cup of coffee or something. I was pretty happy that he asked me to go get coffee, and not go out for a drink or something. I'm not a very big drinker myself, and I don't go out to bars often. For some reason, it seemed like every single match I had gotten before this wanted to take me out for a drink. It was refreshing to have someone offer something else, so we picked a date and time. I told him I would meet him there, since I would be in that part of town. That was a lie, but one of my friends told me to always have a getaway strategy on the first Tinder date, just in case it goes sour. I showed up at the selected cafe a few minutes early and scanned the area. I didn't see him anywhere, so I ordered a cup of coffee and sat down by one of the windows. After about 15 minutes, I was starting to feel like I'd been stood up. I looked around. I had a message from Ron asking where I was, and I responded telling him I had been there for 15 minutes now. I looked around the cafe, and standing by the counter I saw a large and nearly balding man that I didn't recognize. I hadn't thought that could possibly be him when I initially looked around the cafe, because this guy looked nothing like the pictures on his profile. I started to wave, and that's when he noticed me. He flashed a smile and started to jog over me. As he jogged over, I realized right away that this was the very same guy from those photos. It's just those photos must have been taken a very long time ago. He had the same smile and facial features. As we pulled away from a very awkward hug, he noticed I was already drinking a coffee. He seemed to be very annoyed. "Where'd you get that?" I smiled and laughed, telling him I was more than capable of buying my own cup of joe. He just stared at my hand holding the coffee and said some stupid line about how he should have done it for me since he was the one taking me out. I told him not to worry about any of that, and I wasn't really that type of girl. Even though he was not the exact same as his pictures, I didn't want to be too quick to judge. We sat down, and I was excited to actually talk in person and get to know someone I had vibed with well over messaging. Well, I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but I swear to you, he spent 90% of the date talking about how much money he has and how much money he makes. Also, when, not if, we get married. He said I'd never have to work another day in my life. I was polite enough to let the date go on for about an hour or so. Then I told him I had to leave. I'm sure he caught the vibe that I wasn't all that into this. He looked kind of mad I was ending the date. As we were walking back to our cars, he said, "You're not going to invite me over? I wanted to see that world-famous golden retriever you always talk about." I just told him we'd do that another day. I told him I had a family dinner to get to, and I needed to run along now. I got in my car, and when I looked in my mirror, I saw him standing in the same spot, watching me drive away. I'm not sure why, but at that moment I felt very uneasy. At night, my friend Tess came over, and I told her about the strange date and how he was off from the very start. She laughed and said she probably would have done the same thing. Now, around 11 or so, I asked Tess if she would stay over at my place. I don't know why, I just couldn't shake this feeling of anxiety. It only got worse as the night carried on. She agreed, and we both decided to stay in the living room, like a mini sleepover. She passed out quickly, but I was wide awake on the couch, scrolling through my phone. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me at one point, but I had been so focused on my phone that I hadn't realized at first that there was a light shining into my living room window. Since I live on a moderately busy street, it's not uncommon to see light shining through as cars drive by, but this was not that sort of light. It was not moving like a car would, and had been shining for several minutes now. I got up and made my way to the window. Right before I pulled back the silk curtain, the light shut off. I looked out quickly and saw the light had not been from the road at all. It was from my driveway. Right there, parked behind my car, was some red pickup truck I didn't recognize. I ducked down and peeked out from the corner of the window, trying to see if I could identify who the driver was. I figured they must have been lost or something. Right at that moment, I got a message from Ron saying, "Are you kidding me?" I had no idea what he was talking about. I didn't respond. Seconds later, the truck turned back on and pulled out of my driveway. As I watched the truck driving away, it clicked that I'd seen a picture of it before, back on Ron's Tinder profile. It was in the last picture of him, standing next to that very same truck. I messaged him back a question mark and asked if that was him at my house. No response at that moment, and I never got another response from Ron again. I told Tess about it in the morning, and she freaked out, claiming I should have called the police. I was scared and not thinking straight though, and I really didn't think the cops could do anything about it. I mean, what if it was just a coincidence? I don't believe it was, but I also don't have 100% proof it was him either. The reason I'm writing this story now, though, is that I started seeing someone new, and coincidentally, I started seeing that red pickup truck everywhere I go. I can't ever seem to get a glimpse of the driver, but a few nights back I saw it parked across the street from my house the entire night. I haven't reported it yet, but I'm very close to acting. I tried reaching out to Ron one more time, but I think he blocked my number or something. If anything else happens, I'll update this story and share it with you. But until then, be careful meeting people online. You never know who can truly be a creep. This is a really weird and strange thing that happened a few years back. It might not be the scariest thing in the world per se, but due to its unsettling nature, it was definitely creepy to say the least. I ended up going on a vacation with a buddy of mine. Well, I use the word vacation quite loosely. When I think of a vacation, I think of hiking or camping or maybe something like that. I know most people usually think of beaches or pools, though. I went with my friend Colin, who was one of my newer friends. It's actually really funny how we actually became friends. I hated him at first. We worked at the same place and both liked the same girl. We would both flirt with her constantly and she would string us both along. I talked a lot behind his back and he talked a lot about me behind mine. Well, the joke was on us because while she was flirting back with both of us, she ended up getting with another third guy. Because of this, though, he and I got to talking and actually discovered that we had quite a lot in common. It didn't take long for us to start hanging out all the time. When I tell you we had the exact same interests, I mean the exact same. We even both liked the same sports team, the Tennessee Titans, even though we lived in Pennsylvania. One day, he and I got to talking about taking a trip out to the mountains, just hiking and getting away for a while, taking a vacation away from reality. We found a great place to hike, and there was a town nearby as well. Colin did a bunch of research and found some awesome trails. One day, we started quite a long hike that was going to take us most of the day. About an hour or so in, we heard something behind us and turned around, only to see a very strange-looking and short man. He was power walking with his arms in full swing and swooped by us. He was wearing a shirt that was like a windbreaker material, so he was super loud as he passed us by. We both kind of laughed just because of how absurd and out of place this looked. He almost reminded me of a cartoon character or something. That's how strange his outfit was. Another few hours went by, and we completely forgot about the guy. We continued walking, but Colin gasped. His sudden panic freaked me out, so I asked him what was wrong. He didn't say anything at first, and just pointed to some thick bushes that lined this part of the path. The man's windbreaker shirt was sticking out of a bush. I admit I laughed when I saw it. In my mind, I was thinking to myself, what the heck is this dude doing? Colin had a completely different idea. The shirt was all ripped up and thrown into the bushes. He expected the worst. We talked about it for a few minutes, and Colin decided that maybe we should call it in. Due to where we were, we had no cell service whatsoever. We were about halfway there, so I told Colin we should finish up the hike with some pep in our step and keep checking our phones to see if we'd get some service. He agreed, and we started to move quickly along the trail. Probably 20 minutes after discovering the abandoned shirt, we could hear a noise. We both paused and tried to focus on this sound. Within seconds, it became quite clear it was the sound of running. As we looked up, we could see the strange man from before, now running towards us at full speed. We both went into a defensive posture, not really knowing what was going on. As he closed in on us, he kept yelling something like, "I'm gonna get ya! I'm gonna get ya!" He just kept saying it over and over. As he was really close, I was ready to start swinging if I needed to, but he just ran right by us. As he started to fade into the distance, we could hear the echo of his voice for a few more minutes. We both started to burst out laughing, just out of how outrageous this really was. We decided to walk back the way we came and follow the path to this insane guy. Our logic was that we wanted to be good people by making sure this man made it out of the forest without hurting himself. When we were about an hour away from the trailhead, we were suddenly startled by the strange man once more. He jumped down from a tree and was now standing right in front of us, swinging around a thick tree branch at us. Colin tried pleading with this weirdo, but he still kept repeating his mantra, "I'm gonna get you." I started to feel tense standing there with this guy. I didn't know what to do. Clearly, this guy was not right in the head, so I didn't want to hurt him. The flip side, though, was that this guy was clearly ready to hurt us, it seemed like. the now shirtless man was swinging his tree branch and hit Colin right on the side of the arm. He ran right through us, still shouting. As he ran away this time, I noticed that in the waistband of his pants, there was the handle of what looked to be some sort of hunting knife. I told Colin that we seriously needed to go now. I didn't want to encounter this creep again. It was only a matter of time before he introduced us to that knife, and that was something I did not want to experience on my vacation. We basically ran back. As soon as we hit the main road, Colin called the park ranger and told her everything we experienced. She sighed and said this was the third call they'd gotten about the strange man this week. Apparently, the man was running around in the woods assaulting people, but they hadn't been able to track him down at all. It wasn't until months later that I was home and thinking about that day, I really began to realize just how creepy and messed up it was. The idea of some mentally deranged man just running around in the woods with a knife. Not a comforting idea at all. I really hope they caught the guy, because it's clear he needed help. It may have been an unsettling occurrence, but it's for sure one vacation I will never forget. About 7 years ago, I was on one of my first cruises with a group of friends. I was going to be rooming with my friend Sarah, who had been my best friend ever since we were 6 years old. I had never been on a cruise before, so I was both excited and nervous. I know a lot of people get motion sickness while on a cruise. I was worried that I wouldn't feel good and would have to spend the entire trip in the room. We had the fast check-in for the boat, so we were able to pretty much get on the ship in less than an hour. The first night started out really fun. We had some good drinks, checked out our rooms, and started touring the ship. When we sat down for dinner, we were actually able to get a table that seated all 8 of us who knew each other on the cruise. I could tell Sarah was being quiet, though. When I asked what was wrong, she said she was fine. About 10 minutes later, she said she was feeling nauseous and was going back to the room. I told her that I would go with her, but she said she would be okay. She insisted I stay and have something to eat. I did so and had dinner, but I had my mind on Sarah the entire time. I asked the waiter if I could take a meal to go for my friend, who couldn't stay for dinner earlier. He said absolutely, and gave me one to bring to the room. I remember it was just like some chicken and vegetables or something. I asked for the blandest option they had. Thankfully, Sarah was feeling a little better when I got back to the room and did her best to try and get down some of her dinner. She took some motion sickness medication we'd brought just in case, and slowly but surely she started feeling better. We decided to join everyone for trivia later that evening. Everyone was happy to see Sarah feeling better and back with the group. Trivia was really fun. One pair from our group won and got a little trophy shaped like a cruise ship for winning. Everyone else was going to stay out and drink, but I told Sarah I'd go back to the room with her. I was tired anyway. She asked if I would grab a few drinks and some food from what we referred to as the food court. There were a few places open late to get pizza, a sandwich, other things like that. If those were closed, we could always order room service. I told her I would grab something and head back shortly. While I was waiting in line for a sandwich, I was suddenly tapped on the shoulder. Assuming it was one of my friends, I turned around. As I did, I noticed it was not my friend. It was a complete stranger, a younger guy, maybe in his mid-20s. He had pretty patchy facial hair and a very excited expression on his face. "Hey, I noticed you during trivia. You seem really smart, and you're easy on the eyes as well." I said thanks and turned around. Hey, he tapped me again. "Maybe we could grab a drink or something?" I turned around and told him my boyfriend was waiting for me. I grabbed the food that was ready and left the rest and walked away. I hurried back to the room. I was starting not to feel well myself. The hallway was long, and it felt like I was swaying side to side. As I got to the room and tried to regain my composure to unlock the door, I looked to my right and about halfway down the hall, saw what I thought was the same guy from the food court. I shuffled into the room and locked it, and gave the food to Sarah. What I'd estimate was about 5 minutes later, we heard someone outside. We both jumped in surprise, and I got up to go look through the peephole and see who it was. I was half expecting it to be one of our other friends, but instead it was that same guy from before. As I looked out, he was just standing at the door. He didn't say anything. He was just standing there staring at the door. After 45 seconds, he left, and Sarah asked me who it was. I lied and said I didn't know. Must have been someone at the wrong room. The next few days went on without issue, and we were actually having a really good time. I think it was the 4th day, and we were going to be getting back on the 5th. We went to one of the ship shows, kind of like a short Broadway production type thing. When it was over, it was still somewhat dark, and trying to get out of the rows of seats was a little bit difficult. Then I heard someone call out to me, "Hey, funny meeting you again." I turned my head to see the very same guy from a few days earlier. He was wearing the exact same outfit too. I just tried to ignore him. "Hey, I'm talking to you!" At this point, all my friends turned around. My friends Jesse and Mike asked me who this person was. I told them I didn't know. He had been following me around for a long time and trying to talk to me. They told us to go ahead and out the aisle, and they would talk to him once they made it back out. They said not to worry about him, and he wouldn't be bothering me again. At this point, I just wanted to get off this cruise and go home. I couldn't sleep that night. I was anxious to wake up in the morning and gather up to begin the process of letting everyone off the boat. Every time someone walked by the door, I held my breath, thinking that guy was going to knock again. I could also swear that at different points in the middle of the night, I heard scratching at the door, but I don't know if that was just my mind playing tricks on me or what. The next day, we got off the boat, and I was very excited to be back on solid ground. We spent a few days in the city, and when we left, I left the vacation on a high note. I would like to go on a cruise again someday, but I haven't exactly been in a rush, and don't see myself going anytime soon. Back in 2019, I won tickets backstage to one of my favorite bands. Only because I don't really know if I can get in trouble for legal reasons, I'm not going to mention the name of the band. It was one of those radio call-ins, and if you were able to answer the question first, you would get free backstage passes. I considered it a sign at the time. That's the main reason why I even called in to the radio station that day. For starters, I never usually listened to the radio, but I'd accidentally clicked off of my Bluetooth, and the radio automatically came on in my car. The host happened to be asking the question, and I happened to actually know the answer, so I called in and couldn't believe that I got through. I answered the question, and sure enough, I was rewarded with those backstage passes. It was scheduled for a concert at the end of the month. I was pumped, honestly. I never really do anything out of my comfort zone. The next day at work, I gave them notice and told them I was going to be taking my vacation time at the end of the month. Thankfully, they were very cool with it. The concert venue was about an hour from where I lived, and I decided to make a weekend vacation trip out of it. I arrived there on Friday and spent the day in the city. I went out to a local bar that night. Saturday night came and I had to be at the show at a certain time. When I arrived, I was blown away. Being backstage at one of those shows was almost indescribable. There were a bunch of us there backstage, and we all mingled and hung out for most of the night. We were going to meet the band, of course, but we would have to wait until after the show. There was some lady who was directing us all night. I'm not sure if she was like a manager or a publicist or what. I'm honestly clueless in this sort of world, so I have no idea what her title was. After the show, we were told the band was going to party with us, and I was even more stoked. Not only was I at the show, but I was going to have the chance to hang out with one of my favorite bands. This was honestly a dream come true. During the show, I had been talking to one of the girls that was also backstage. Her name was Morgan, and she seemed like a pretty wild girl. I was all about it, honestly. We bonded throughout the entire show, sharing our love of the same music, movies, and even anime. I know this sounds premature, but I felt an instant connection with her. We exchanged numbers, and even set a date to hang out after this was all over. She lived about 30 minutes away from where I lived, and that wasn't very far for me to drive, especially for this girl. The concert ended, and without doing anything else, the band made their way to this private room that we were all hanging out in. They were pouring with sweat from their performance, but it was such a surreal moment. Standing just inches away from me was a handful of my idols. Just as I was getting ready to talk with them, Morgan stepped out in front of me and introduced herself to the band. She kept rubbing the lead singer's arm, and he wasn't having it. I could tell he wasn't trying to be rude, but I could also tell he didn't like her touching him. He kept awkwardly shifting around. Then Morgan said probably the weirdest thing she could have in that moment. In the most confident voice possible, she said, "Oh, don't worry about him." She pointed at me and then continued talking. "That's my husband. He's okay with me touching your arm. You don't have to be creeped out." I didn't even know how to react. I didn't say anything out loud. I was so confused that she'd called me her husband out of nowhere. The singer of the band just sort of laughed and said, "Okay, right on, brother." He then awkwardly walked away. Minutes later, the band left the room. After that, the manager lady came back in and said the band was having a long way to travel, so unfortunately they needed to go early. I was so upset. They were only there for like 5 minutes. I didn't even get to talk to them, and it was all because of Morgan being weird and creepy. The fact that she spoke for me and I didn't even get to say hi made me very angry. Obviously, everyone else in the room was upset too, but that was life, I guess. We all started making our way to the exit, but that's when Morgan lost it without any warning. Suddenly, she threw a punch at the back of my head and knocked me to the ground. She got down on the ground and started to hit me, and started to verbally roast me. She claimed it was all my fault the band had left, and that if I wasn't so creepy, I wouldn't have scared them off. I quickly got up to my feet and tried to move to the door. I didn't want to deal with any of what was going on here. She started to follow me, and continued to verbally harass me, saying things like I was a piece of garbage, and telling everyone there that I'm the reason they left early. It got ugly. Eventually, I was escorted out by security. Yes, I was escorted out. Even the witnesses and the frickin' manager were confused as to why I was being forcibly removed and not Morgan, but I didn't care. I was just happy to be away from this girl. I remember going back to my room that night and thinking about how strange the night had been so far. When I really thought back on the details, it kind of blew my mind. The next morning, I left early to head home. I saw I had about 23 messages from Morgan when I woke up. Every message was completely different. I'd get a message about how sorry she was and how she wanted to know if I was okay. Then 1 minute later, she'd message me saying that I was the worst person ever. I blocked this crazy person's number and made my drive home. I was trying to just focus on the good memories from this trip. When I got there, I was surprised to see a car in my driveway that I didn't recognize. Needless to say, I was very confused. Slowly, I approached the door. When I got there, I saw it was already open and slightly ajar. Instead of instantly calling the police, I decided to peek inside. I couldn't believe my eyes. Sitting in my reclining chair with her eyes closed was Morgan. I had no idea how she found out where I lived and got there before me. Maybe I'd told her at the concert or something, but honestly, I couldn't remember doing so. She must have been asleep because she didn't react to me entering at all. I stepped back outside and went all the way to the road, then called the police and told them what was happening. They showed up pretty quickly and escorted her out of the house. As she was being detained, she was screaming that everything was my fault. I was so terrified and disturbed by this that I ended up staying at my parents' home for a couple of weeks. I never did see Morgan again after that morning, and hopefully I never do. This is an experience I had when I stayed with my family in a guest house way out in the mountains. My daughter was quite young when this happened. I believe she was about 4 years old. My husband and I thought that we had put her down for bed for the night and she was sleeping away soundly, but we were wrong. We were in the living room area of this guest house. I suppose it was just after midnight when our daughter came rushing out of her bedroom over to us. "What's wrong, sweetie? Do you need to use the bathroom?" I asked her. She shook her head. I remember she looked really shaken up. It was definitely a rare look for a girl her age. She told me that the lady outside had been asking to let her in, but she couldn't reach the lock on the window. She asked if I could do it for her. I sat there staring at her, unable to comprehend what she had just said. We were literally in the middle of nowhere. We had driven miles and miles to get to this log cabin, and there wasn't another residence anywhere nearby. I didn't know how to approach the topic with my daughter. I didn't want to call her a liar for having a bad dream. Before my husband could open his mouth, I asked her who had said that to her. As soon as those words left my mouth, the concern inside me like a flower bloomed. My question to my daughter boomed repeatedly in my head. "Who said that to you?" My daughter seemed to sense my distress, and I'll be honest with you, I don't think I exactly hid my concern very well. I must have looked very unsettled. "The lady with the hurt head outside the window. She's been banging and banging on the glass." I shot a glance over to my husband. We jumped on our feet and marched straight into the room my daughter was sleeping in. I went to turn on the lights, but my husband stopped me. He said if there was someone outside, then we would be able to see them on the outside if the light was off, and they wouldn't be able to see us as easily. To my surprise, I did see something against the window. I know I saw something there. It was a white shadowy figure, almost like a kind of mist or some smoke or something. I could make out the rough outline of a person as well. Then it slipped out of sight. The smoke also dissipated. My husband asked us to wait inside with the door locked, while he went outside to check on the situation. My daughter then spoke to me. "The lady was sad, Mom. She looked hurt, too." I was really frightened at the idea that there might really be someone out there trying to persuade my child to let them in. Equally frightening was that I may have just had an encounter with something supernatural. My husband eventually returned from checking outside. I say eventually, but it must have been a matter of only a couple of minutes. It really felt like an eternity, though. I didn't see anyone out there, no footprints either. I mean, there's gravel around the whole building. Surely we would have heard someone run off. I didn't even hear a thing outside. I went by the door while he was stood there and held my daughter's hand tightly. As I approached, the door was open, and my husband went to close it. I stopped him. I wanted to take one last good look out there. All that I could see was a dark sea of trees. The tree line was about 20 feet from the cabin. All I could think of was what could be hiding within that tree line. I could hear the bugs chirping and the wind blowing. It was at that point I shut the door. If someone really needed help like my daughter had said, surely they would come back while the door was wide open and ask us directly. We all slept in the same bed that night, and thankfully nothing else suspicious happened after that. I will say I was completely on edge until we left that cabin. It's the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. I always wonder who that hurt lady was and why she wanted my daughter to let her in. there's a few things I want to clear up about this story. This wasn't so much a horror story in the moment, as I was quite young and naive at the time. The real fear came years later, once I had grown up and realized both what could have and what did happen. Honestly, for me this story doesn't so much hold as fear, as much as it does anger, betrayal, and disappointment. Also, some minor details like ages may be fuzzy, since this happened a long time ago. With that being said, I'll go ahead and get into it. I was somewhere between 10 to 12 years old, and my younger brother was about 6 to 8. I used to play tennis at my town's civic center, an activity I now detest beyond belief. So, my tennis coach, who I'll call in, and my mother, Jay, caught wind of the fact there had been a registered sex offender lingering near the courts and driving by. I never found out this guy's name, nor have I bothered to ask about it either. So anyway, Ann and Jay found out about this guy and his apparent record. You'd think they'd call the police right away, but you're wrong. They must have figured they couldn't do that without getting proof of his activities first. So, what did they do? Well, they began following his car discreetly, eventually coming to the parking lot of a Kmart, back when that was still a thing. They parked out of his sight and began putting their plan into action. What plan was that, you may ask? Well, I hope you're all ready to be very angry. N and J told my brother and I to walk inside the Kmart alone and go to the toy section. They would then film us and try to catch the creep on camera before scaring him off or calling the police. Then Jay promised she would pick us up. Let me just reiterate that these two people were my mother and a tennis coach, a family friend, who asked a tween and a little boy to go with a child molester in hopes of getting him to do something to us, all so they could catch him red-handed. I never found out if he even got out of the car. All I remember is that she picked us up as promised. Years later, this memory resurfaced, and it really hit me. Holy crap, my brother and I were literally used to bait a child predator. I tried to confront my mother about it years later, but she didn't even let me ask her about it at all, becoming defensive and saying it was N's idea, etc. Imagine being that defensive over using your own kids as bait. I've been thinking about broaching this topic again once more, confidently this time, either with her, N, or both. I need to get some kind of closure about this matter. It really had an impact on my feelings about my own mother and that coach. I don't know if I can ever forgive either of them. I know that some of you might be saying, it happened a long time ago and you didn't even get hurt. How's this even a horror story? Well, it's a horror story because two people, one of whom brought my brother and I into this world, used us children they claim to love as bait for the worst kind of person, and then they just ignored it as if nothing ever happened. Like I said, I don't know if I can forgive them for this, but even if I did, it would be for my sake, not theirs. The reason I'm sharing this is because I'm tired of carrying it all by myself. I've told a few other people, all of whom have expressed outrage, rightly so. Anyway, that's my story. Thank you all for listening. This was a while back, but it still bothers me to this day. It was 2016, and me, 22 at the time, and my husband, who was 28, were moving into a rental home. I was 6 months pregnant, and we were thrilled to move into a nice community. Before, we had lived in a pretty sketchy part of town. We didn't know much about this rental, except it was in a good school district in a low-crime area, and within our budget as well. Time passed by without any problems, and soon our son was born. His birth was textbook, and he slept well in the hospital. This all changed, though, when we brought him home. The first night home was awful. Every time we sat him in his crib, he screamed and cried. I'm not talking about a normal "I'm hungry" or "need a new diaper" cry either. It was a legitimate scream like he was in terrible pain. My husband and I had to take shifts at night, so one of us could be with him and the other could sleep a little. My shift was always second and started around 2 to 3 in the morning. I tried my best to sleep, but shortly after my son's birth, I began having horrible nightmares. I would dream nightly about my son being injured or needing me, and I couldn't get to him. At my 6-week checkup, I told my OBGYN, and she believed I was having postpartum anxiety. She prescribed me some medicine and recommended I see a counselor. Weeks passed by since starting the medication and counseling, and I was still having these nightmares. My son was still screaming all night long as well. His pediatrician told us that it was colic, and we needed to wait everything out. Everything changed when he turned 3 months old. His screaming continued, but started to be all day instead of just at night. My nightmares became much more specific as well. One night I dreamed I walked into my son's room, and he was on fire screaming. Though I was in his room, my feet were stuck inside his doorway, and I couldn't move or speak. I woke up screaming and hyperventilating. My husband ran into our room and tried to console me. In the next few days, I could not sleep at all. I spent most of my days at work, and my evenings sitting on my front porch and talking to my next-door neighbor. She was the sweetest old lady who had lived in this neighborhood since it was originally built in the 70s. I guess she could tell something was wrong and asked me if I was okay. Reluctantly, I told her about how my baby had been acting and how I was having horrible nightmares. She was sympathetic and asked me to elaborate. I didn't feel comfortable telling her the details, so I just told her I'd had dreams about fires in the house. Her face quickly changed from caring and concerned to horrified. Seconds of quiet felt like hours before she spoke again. "Do you know what happened at this house?" she said. I told her no. She sighed and looked down, then looked at me. She went on to tell me that a few years ago, there was a fire at the home due to some faulty wiring. There was a young family with a 3-month-old baby living there, and unfortunately the baby passed away in the fire. She said the couple moved away, and the house was renovated and put up for rent after. At that moment, I was in complete shock. I ran inside to my husband holding our baby and told him that we needed to leave. He must have seen the fear in my eyes, since he didn't ask me to explain myself. When we got in the car, I explained what happened and how I felt like my dreams were warnings that we needed to leave before something happened to our baby. Luckily, my brother-in-law lived in the next town over, so we stayed there. The very first night we stayed in this new home, our son slept through the entire night with not a single peep. I checked on him every hour, since it was so unusual for him to sleep this well. From then on, apart from normal baby stuff, my son never screamed again like he did in that house. My husband packed up our stuff and we stayed with my brother-in-law until we were able to get out of our lease and rent a new place. I never went back, and I will never go back. I just pray for whoever moves in there next. I'm 27. My husband is 30 and our daughter is 1. This story happened just last night, so I'm running off like 2 hours of sleep. My daughter wasn't into the idea of sleeping in this morning. Now to start, my husband, our 1-year-old, and myself live in a rental and have been there for 3 years now. When we first moved in, there was this random doorbell noise that would go off. There wasn't a doorbell here that we could see though, and we thought there was probably a battery-powered one stored in the attic or something that was dying or malfunctioning. It eventually stopped, so we just kinda forgot about it for the most part. My husband also used to see what he called shadow people and hear footsteps and have horrible sleep paralysis dreams. I always chalked it up to his mind playing tricks on him or him trying to scare me. It had been a few years since any of that stopped happening though, and for the year that our daughter lived with us, zero spooky things happened at all. That was until last night. My husband works the night shift, so it was just me and the baby. It was that way for most nights. Well, last night, my daughter woke up at around midnight, so I grabbed her and brought her to my bed. She went back to sleep, and I was wide awake, scrolling through Hulu and searching for a show to watch. I kid you not. All of a sudden, the foot of my bed frame lifted up half a foot off the ground and slammed back down. My daughter was still asleep, but I was immediately frozen in fear. My first thought was, is there someone under my bed right now? I quickly realized that I couldn't even fit under my bed, so this was a far-fetched theory. It didn't make me feel any better, though. I scooped my daughter up football style and stood on my bed. I jumped off as far as possible and ran out of the room. I grabbed our gun and called my husband, shaking and sobbing to please come home. Then I called my mom to pick us up. At that point, our kitchen lights started to dim until they completely shut off. That was the last straw for me. I took my daughter and went to the front yard in only a t-shirt and panties. My husband got home about 10 minutes later and did a sweep of the house. Nothing seemed out of place, which weirdly made me even more scared. I would rather a stranger be under my bed than some invisible force, but still I went to my mother's. I finally fell asleep about 3:30, and my husband picked us up at 5 a.m. when he got off work. I'm afraid to sleep here, so I've been awake ever since. I don't know how I'm going to be here alone at night anymore. I'm trying to debunk what happened and find an explanation, but I just can't. It may not sound scary to you, but I had never felt so scared in my life. Scary stuff like that is 10 times worse when you have a baby to protect. What do I do? How do I bless my home correctly without making things worse? I don't drink or do any drugs, so it's not like I was tripping or something. My mom is a paranormal buff. My husband and I agreed after one too many crappy spouses and scary movies to always believe each other when we say something is up. So they both believed me, but I still feel crazy. This happened in college. At the time, I was 18 and a sophomore. I had just recently gotten out of a 6-year relationship and was starting to get back into the dating scene. I downloaded Tinder and got to swiping. For some background, I didn't want to talk to someone that went to my university, because thinking about running into someone I was talking to out in the wild made me really anxious. I ended up matching with this guy we'll call Marco. Marco was 20 and a junior at the neighboring university about 15 minutes up the road. He had one selfie and 2 other pictures that were group photos. They seemed older, but I didn't really think much of it. We started chatting, and he very quickly asked for my phone number. I would say it's a little too early for that, but he kept insisting, so eventually I gave in. After about 2 days of talking, he started asking for pictures of me, so I sent him some selfies. He tried to ask for more provocative pictures, but I shut him down. I told him I wasn't interested in that sort of thing, and I just wanted to see where things went. Marco would say how he couldn't wait to meet me, so he could kiss me and touch me. Every time he would say that, I would change the subject. We planned a date after a week of talking. He said he knew a good Indian restaurant over by his school, and we could walk in the downtown area after. I agreed, as it would be a public place. The day came for the date, and again I started to get a weird feeling. I told my roommate what we had planned, and she said she would keep her phone on her if I needed her. A few hours before the date, I got cold feet and told him my car wouldn't start. I asked for a reschedule. He offered to pick me up, and I kept telling him no, and that we would reschedule for another time. He kept insisting and started to make me feel guilty. He was saying how much he was looking forward to it for the past few days, and I was really hurting his feelings. He would be more than willing to come get me, but I wouldn't give him the chance. Well, I caved in, and it was the worst decision ever. Despite the feelings I was having, I gave him the information to get to the lot outside my dorm. Right when I got into the car, I realized this was going to be a horrible date. Right away, he tried to grab my hand and asked to give me a kiss as well. When I denied, he started driving off. On the way to our destination, he said that he was no longer going to the restaurant at all. We were going back to his apartment instead, and he was going to cook me dinner. At that point, my heart sunk, and I started to have a small panic attack. I texted my roommate and let her know what was going on. She was worried and said she would come get me if I needed. We arrived at his place, and when I say his apartment was disgusting, I mean it was covered in trash, dirty clothes, and dishes. He said that we had to go into his room because his roommate was home, and he didn't like it when he had company. His bedroom was even worse than the common area. There was only a single pad to the bed, and the bathroom was so dirty. We sat on his bed and he turned on a movie. I can't remember what it was. All I remember was the nauseating stench of the room and him trying to make advances on me. He started touching my back and shoulders, and I scooted away to put some distance between us. After a few minutes, he tried to force himself on me. He started to kiss me and shoved me down. He climbed on top of me and forced his entire body weight on me, and I couldn't move a single inch. I was paralyzed by fear. Thankfully, he didn't get any further than that. Just as quickly as he jumped on me, he was running to his restroom and began vomiting everywhere. I've never been so thankful. I don't know why he got sick even. When he came out, he apologized and said it happened all the time, then said I needed to get out. Trembling, I straightened myself up and followed him out. I still didn't know if he was going to try anything else, and I didn't want to aggravate him or say anything wrong. I tried to act like everything was okay, to get home safely. When we pulled up to my building, he told me he wanted to make it up to me. I just nodded and said goodnight, and jumped out of the car. Once inside, I blocked him, reported him on Tinder, and deleted the app as well. I also took extra measures to block him on any social media I could find. I didn't tell anyone at first what happened. I was embarrassed because I put myself in that position. When I started getting calls from random numbers, though, whenever I answered, there wouldn't be anyone on the other line. I would block the number and a new one would immediately begin calling. It got to the point where my phone was ringing constantly. Along with the phone calls were random Facebook and Instagram messages from accounts I didn't recognize. They would all say things like, "Why are you ignoring me? Why aren't you talking to me?" They started getting more aggressive and threatening. My roommate started getting messages as well, and I had to tell her everything. She told me I needed to report him, or at least tell my parents. I didn't do either because I was scared of what would happen. That is, until I started receiving random pictures of myself. They would be of me walking on campus, in the dining hall, in class. I even got one of me in my dorm room, taken through my window, which was on the second floor. The main street was on a hill at the same level as my window that my room faced, and my bed was right there. I told my roommate, and she made me tell our RA. The RA was very concerned and ended up calling the campus police. I made a report with them. The messages continued, and so did the photos. That was until one day when he suddenly ambushed me on campus. He grabbed me by the arm and tried to drag me to his car. I started to yell and scream, and luckily there was a campus officer nearby. He was arrested and banned from the campus altogether, and I didn't hear from him again. This was in 2014, so some of my memories aren't as vivid. I've tried to block this part of my past out. Not many people know what happened to me. To this day, my family doesn't even know. The only people that do are my college roommate, the RA, the campus police, my therapist, and as of the other night, my fiancé. I want to spread awareness of the dangers of online dating. Always trust your gut. If something doesn't seem right, it probably isn't. Not all online dating has consequences, though. I met my fiancé a few years later on Facebook dating. Your gut is usually right, though, and sometimes it's very crucial to listen to it. I was about 13 when this happened. My parents were gone for a weekend on a trip together and left me and my two siblings home alone. Our grandma was just a minute down the road if we needed her, and my sister was 18 at the time, so it wasn't a big deal for a night or two. I was in the spare bedroom, which had a couch, TV, and Xbox 360 in it. I was really into playing and using it to watch Netflix on. It was summer of 2015, by the way. I was watching some random show. Knowing me, it was probably Vampire Diaries or something. It was around 9 or 10 at night, and that's when I began to hear something strange. A gentle knocking on the window, barely even audible. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just a weird little noise. I kept scrolling through memes on my iPod and watching TV. When it happened again, that's about when I started to freak out. The windows in the room had curtains over them, so I couldn't see who was doing this. I knew I needed to get the fuck out of there, though. I went to get my older sister and told her what was happening. As I moved through the house, the knocking on the windows followed me. She and my brother heard the knocking on the glass too, and started freaking out with me. My sister had me and my brother hide in the corner of our kitchen that doesn't have any windows. She made sure our front door was locked as well. We called our parents and then our grandma. They had us call our next-door neighbor to take a quick look around. He was a Vietnam vet in his 60s at the time, so we knew he had guns and training if needed. Unfortunately, he did not find anything. We were all unsettled the rest of the night, but knew our parents were coming home the next day. Fortunately, everything was okay, and it didn't happen again. To this day, about a decade later, it still bothers me not knowing who it was. I went to my boyfriend's house to sleep after working overnight one day. I was under the covers to avoid the sunlight that was peeking in through the blinds. I remember that all of a sudden, I felt something tugging on my toe and tickling my foot. I laughed and told him to leave me alone so I could get some more sleep. The tugging stopped, but I felt a hand grab my butt. I started to doze off back to sleep, assuming that my boyfriend had come home early from work and was messing with me as usual. Hours later, I woke up to find that I was all alone. I texted my boyfriend and asked him where he'd gone. He responded that he was still at work and had been there ever since 5 a.m. I was hiking in Kosovo. One creep stalked me for 4 hours on foot. I saw him a couple of times, but he didn't approach me at first. I didn't figure out until later that he was waiting for the darkness and for me to set up camp. He finally began to approach me. I remember it was on a high hill in the middle of the night. He ran out of a forest, jumped and caught me, and tried to tackle me to the ground. I pulled out my knife and tried to stab him. He fell down and rolled down the hill, and I began to run. He sprinted after me and reached me again. This time, though, he was more wary and kept his distance, just observing me. I stood there like an idiot too, waiting for what he would pull as his next move. It took me about a minute to realize he was jerking off in complete silence and complete darkness. He finished, moaned once, and then left, and I never saw the guy again after. This happened a couple of years ago. One night, I was driving to go pick up my girlfriend from her job. She did have a car, but it was in the shop getting some repairs. She worked late that night, until about 11 p.m. or so. I drove the 20-minute drive to get there, and then she climbed into my vehicle. We started driving back, and the roads were really quiet. Because it was so late at night, there was almost nobody out and about. As we were on the way back, almost halfway there, my car ironically began to break down. It was a somewhat old car and hadn't been running that great, but I still didn't expect it to break down on the side of the road like it did. With it being so late at night, neither of us knew anybody that could give us a ride. I tried restarting the car myself several times, but I was unsuccessful. So there we were, sitting on the side of this dead quiet road. Within the first 5 minutes of sitting there, maybe just 2 or 3 cars drove by. We finally decided to call roadside assistance, thinking they should be able to help us out. After calling, we were told they would come, but it might be a 45-minute wait. Well, that was disappointing, but at least they would be there eventually. The place where my car was broken down was a quiet road that had mostly wild land on both sides. It was very dark and hard to see much of anything at all. My girlfriend and I were just chatting and going on our phones while we waited. Not long into this wait, though, we saw the headlights of a car coming down the road behind us. We didn't think much of it, as other cars had passed us by before. As it approached, though, we noticed it was going pretty slow. The car passed us by, and I noticed it was an old white work van, probably from some time in the 1980s. It was pretty old and creepy looking. The way it was driving so slow was a little strange too. I made a joke about it to my girlfriend, but I was actually wondering why it was going so slowly. It drove past us and disappeared around a corner further up ahead. About 5 minutes or so went by, without a single car. Then we saw headlights behind us again. As this next vehicle approached, we noticed it was the very same white van from earlier. It passed us by, going slow once more. I remember making a comment about it being the very same one, and how this seemed really strange. It drove out of sight just like the first time, though, so I wasn't nervous yet. Just a couple of minutes after that, it drove by again. We saw the headlights coming up from behind us, and even guessed it was the same truck before it arrived. Sure enough, it was. This time, though, it was going even slower. I made another joke that maybe this was AAA arriving, but I was actually getting pretty nervous. The truck passed us by, but then started to pull over to the side of the road right in front of us. It parked about 40 feet or so in front of my vehicle. We didn't know who this was or what they were doing. I wanted to leave there so badly. I tried starting my car engine again, but nothing happened. The truck just sat there for several minutes, but nobody got out. The suspense was killing me. We then saw the front driver's door open, and a man climbed out. He walked around the front of his truck into the passenger side. I didn't get a good look at him at all. After he got to the passenger side, we couldn't really see what he was doing. He was mostly out of our line of sight. It was almost like he was hiding behind the truck. He stayed there for a couple of minutes as well. Then he started to move out and walk in our direction. My heart was racing like crazy. I felt like I needed to do something, but I didn't know what to do. I remembered that after the man had started walking, I noticed headlights of another car starting to come up behind us. Without even giving it any thought, I opened my driver's door and got out as the car was approaching on the road. I stood in the middle of the lane and waved, trying to get this car to stop. When I did, the car started to slow down, and I also heard a noise from behind me. I looked over and saw the suspicious man getting back inside his vehicle. He then very quickly drove away out of there, above the speed limit. When the car stopped in the road, I got out of the way and let them drive past. They probably thought I was crazy, but at least it got the creepy man to drive away. I went back to my car with my girlfriend. After that, we were worried the van would come back yet again. I honestly thought that it would, but to my surprise, it did not. In fact, not very many cars at all came by for the rest of the time we waited. Eventually, my roadside assistant showed up, and they were able to tow my car. I still often wonder, though, what that guy in the van was planning to do. This happened when I was in elementary school a long time ago. I used to be part of this school club called the Forestry School. They held a lot of events for kids, and this experience takes place when I was in year 6. They had this one event which was a 2-night trip to stay out in the elements. We would be sleeping out in the forest in the shade of the mountains. It was in a place called the something Boys Nature House. I can't exactly remember the specific name at the moment. It seemed really fun at the time, though. All us kids pitched in to make dinner that evening, and it was really great. Didn't even feel like a chore at all, really. It was good, amazing tasting. After dinner was over, we had a great time, just sat around the campfire. It was a really chill night, but only up until that point. Things started to go downhill after that. The teacher, or leader if you will, of the forestry school event, told us kids that we would have to take an uphill walk to the dormitory we would be staying in that very same night. I think he said it was going to be a 300-meter climb, and that made a few of us kids grumble a little. I think one of the teachers picked up on this and tried to make the uphill walk a little bit more fun by saying it would be a spooky walk. We should see it as a test of our collective courage to walk up the hill through the forest in the dark. The plan was for us kids to pair up and walk with flashlights. I guess this would allow the teachers to keep attendance of us by head count. Although it was phrased as a kind of spooky walk, there were no hidden surprises or anything like that. No one was going to jump out on us wearing any ghost costumes or make wailing sounds in the woods. We had our flashlights in hand, and we were ready to be on our way. There were no street lights that far out in the woods, obviously. I heard from my brother that they'd done this the year before, and some of the kids in his group had found it really scary, so I was kind of looking forward to it. The teachers on the trip were stood at different points on the opposite sides of the path, in approximately equal intervals. That was just in case the students got lost or had any issues. We were lined up by surnames. I was right at the back because my surname starts with W. I found out that because we had an odd number of students on the trip, I would be doing the creepy walk alone. The teachers thought I wouldn't mind, since I was a little older than some of the other kids. To be honest, though, I would have really preferred to have been buddied up with someone else. When I get to the end of my experience, I think you'll understand why that would have been better than going alone. I don't really know why they didn't allow me to be in a group of 3 instead of going by myself. Maybe it was offered to me and I just wasn't paying attention, or maybe they didn't think of it. One good thing was as soon as I passed the first of the 6 teachers at the start of the route, he would follow on behind. The one thing that was annoying, though, was the fact that I had to wait 5 good minutes after the last pair before I could start walking. I had to wait. As soon as they went up around a right turn and out of sight, about 50 meters ahead, I started walking along the path, swinging my flashlight left to right over the trees and bushes. It was pretty creepy. Even though I knew I wasn't, it felt like I was the only person out there in the woods that night. After a while, I saw the first teacher at the first curve coming up and gave him a little nod. As soon as I climbed that right curve, I noticed there was a sharp incline. There was a guardrail to the left, and beyond that guardrail was a row of trees. I saw another teacher stood just beyond the guardrail. I couldn't really see their face very well, due to how dark the area they were standing in was. I didn't exactly want to shine my flashlight in the teacher's face, since that's a bad thing to do and it could easily hurt their eyes. I didn't recognize them from what I could see, but that wasn't all that unusual. I didn't know all the teachers on this particular trip. This guy was stood at the break in the guardrail. There looked to be a forest trail behind where he was. It looked like it was the path or route we should be walking down. I thought that was the right way to go, so I started walking toward the figure. They even started beckoning me to come with them, so I followed as he disappeared down the forest path. I started going with him, but was suddenly stopped in my tracks from someone shouting behind me. I froze and felt an adult hand grab me on the shoulder and pull me backwards. I could hear someone running down the forest trail ahead of me. As I was stopped, I turned to face whoever had stopped me and saw it was the first teacher who had been at the first curve. He had a very serious expression on his face. I asked him what was wrong, but he didn't say anything. He gripped my hand tight and walked away with me from that gap in the guardrail. He stuck right by my side for the rest of the way toward the dormitory and didn't exactly tell me what happened. That night, I spent all night thinking I had done something wrong. It wasn't until I was much older that I fully realized what the situation was. I think there are a couple of possibilities that could explain my experience, and I would like to ask for your opinions on my theories. One is that I might have seen some kind of spirit. Some kids I told my experience to said they saw wilted flowers by the side of the road, and with the guardrail having a hole in it, it might have been caused by an accident at some point in time. Some people think it was a spirit jealous of the living, trying to lead me away to the afterlife. I don't know about that, but it is a theory certainly. The second and much more frightening option, in my opinion, is that there was really a person out there in the woods that night. They might have been aware that there would be many kids out there because it was an annual event. I shudder to think what might have happened to me if the actual teacher hadn't been right behind me, keeping a close eye on me. I nearly went with a total stranger down that forest trail into the middle of the dark forest. I guess I'll never truly know the answer. This story takes place about 4 years ago. It was my wife, my dog, and myself. We were on the second day of an 80-kilometer hike in northern Ontario. We set up camp on a point about 750 meters into the lake trail. We had been hearing wolves since about 9 p.m. and went to bed by 10. The howls were getting closer and closer when one howled from right behind us on the trail. I got out of the tent and started making loads of noise in an attempt to scare it off. This usually works for bears, whom we've had loads of encounters with. I didn't see anything there, and didn't hear anything either. I went back to bed and tried to lay down, trying to act confident as to not upset my wife. That's when we both began to hear something outside the tent. My dog was crazy quiet, shaking in place. I opened the tent to find a wolf staring at me from about 15 feet away. I grabbed my bear spray and took aim. I didn't use it just yet, but I started screaming at the wolf. I took a few charges towards it. Again, this usually works when faced with a bear if you have no escape. The wolf didn't really seem to care that I was yelling at it though. It hung out for a few seconds, then very casually walked into the tree line, just far enough that I couldn't see it anymore. I built a fire between the tent and the bush and sat up all night. I kept my headlamp on too, and had to listen to a pack of 3 or 4 wolves howling around us all night long. Every 20 minutes they would sound off. They were very close to us. I would estimate them to be within 50 yards circling us. I was sure they were here to come and get my dog. At about 6 a.m., a bunch of them started howling together. way more than during the night. We waited until about 8 o'clock, packed all our stuff, and got out of there. We were 36 kilometers in, and it had taken us a 2 days hike. We hiked out in 6.5 hours. About 1.5 hours into our hike out, the wolves started circling us again. They were following us. While we were moving, we saw a bear with 2 cubs. This would usually concern us quite a bit, but we wanted to get the hell out of there. My wife lost all her toenails from the sheer intensity of the hike back, and my poor dog got some serious anxiety about being in the wolves' presence. When I was younger and in college, I used to work at this shoe store. The store was part of a strip mall that was in a very large shopping area. I would work there during the summers when I was back home at my parents' house from school. One night, I worked later, until closing. I think that we closed around 10 p.m. or so. The store was not that big, and I had worked there for a while, so I was trusted to close the store by myself. At around 10 p.m., I'd finished wrapping up everything I had to do, and then I left. When I walked outside into the parking lot, it was basically a ghost town. When I had gotten there initially, things had been so busy that I'd been forced to park a long distance away. Our parking lot was shared with another business in our little strip mall. There were other stores with huge parking lots as well, and they were all connected at least a little. I guess I wasn't really that far away in the grand scheme of things. Anyway, I walked out to my car and climbed inside, but to my surprise, when I tried starting the engine, it refused to start. It made a weird noise and wouldn't turn over. I really didn't know anything about cars, and I wasn't sure what to do. I called my dad and told him it wasn't starting. He told me he would come down and see what was going on himself, and he would be there in about 30 minutes. Then I just had to sit there and wait. As I was in the parking lot, I looked all around me. Things were extremely quiet. There were no cars nearby at all. There were only a few parked extremely far away on the complete other side. I went on my phone, scrolling through social media and things like that. I remember looking up at one point, though, and noticing a man walking through the parking lot. He was wearing a hood and looking down. He kind of walked through the lot near me. Then it looked like he was starting to head directly toward my car. He stopped for a second, then sort of turned again and started walking in another direction. He went back in the direction he had come from, and after walking around the parking lot for several more minutes, he dipped out of sight behind a nearby building. It seemed a little bit sketchy to me. I didn't really know what this guy was doing. It seemed like he was kind of wandering around, like he didn't have a specific destination in mind. The way he had been eyeing my car also made me very nervous. For the next few minutes, everything was fine, but I really had to use the restroom. I didn't want to wait, and I knew there was a gas station not that far away, so I decided to walk there. I was a little bit nervous to get out, what with that guy wandering around. He had been out of sight now for several minutes though, so I decided to go. It would take me almost 10 minutes to get to the gas station. I got out of my car and started to walk. On the entire walk there, I didn't see the man or anybody else. I got to the gas station and used the restroom, then went back out. I walked towards my car. When I got to the building that I worked in and was passing it by, I saw my car in the parking lot still, but then I saw that strange man from earlier. He was standing right next to my vehicle, kind of messing around with it. I saw him trying to open the door, then he hit a window with something. As I was there, standing a good distance away, the man seemed to notice me. He stopped and immediately started walking in my direction. I moved back and slipped behind the building, but I could see the man was still coming after me. Soon he reached the building as well. I walked all around the back side of it, and he kept following me. I made a lap around the entire building. When I made it around to the front again, I saw my dad and his pickup truck arriving in the parking lot. As he was driving up to my vehicle, I started to run over there. When I did, the man started to run after me from behind. I was going at full speed for my dad's truck, but the man was easily gaining on me. I remember that when I was getting closer, my dad yelled something out his window. He was probably asking me what was going on, but I don't remember what he said exactly. The guy was so close to me that I decided not to try and get into the passenger side of my dad's truck. Instead, I ran for the bed and jumped up and pulled myself inside. Just as I did, my dad knew exactly what to do. He slammed the gas and started speeding away. To my surprise, the guy reached the truck and actually tried to grab onto it and hold on. We were already going too fast for him to jump in. He ran with it, trying to chase us for a few moments, but we were able to leave the parking lot and get away from him. I rode in the back of my dad's truck until we made it a good distance away. He stopped and I got into the passenger seat. After that, my dad called the cops and told them some guy was chasing me in the parking lot. We returned to the scene to find the man was obviously gone, but there were a few noticeable dents all over my car. He must have kicked it a bunch or hit it with something. I was so mad about it, but the car was old and not very nice, to be honest. I ended up getting a new one not long after that. My name is Rachel. I'm 23 and I'm from Dublin, Ireland. The other day, I was on my way home from work. My route home takes me through a park that I walk through almost every single day. The path I was down cuts through the park diagonally, and there are metal benches at certain spots along the path. The other day, as I was walking through the park, there was a man sat down on one of the benches. He looked like he was just minding his own business, and him being there didn't set off any immediate alarm bells. I'm not stupid, and I've been in a handful of situations already where I'd seen creepy fellas hanging about and thought, nah, I think I'll take a cab home tonight. But in this case, I didn't get any of those vibes at all from this man. I walked down the path, and the man continued minding his own business and didn't pay me any attention at all. As I got within a few feet of him, though, I could hear him saying something to himself. Or perhaps it could have been directed at me. I couldn't exactly hear what he was saying, though. It was very quiet, almost a whisper. I ignored him at first, but as I passed him by, I saw him stand up from the bench out of the corner of my eye. I realized he had started following me. I took out my earbuds. Then, as I carried on walking, with the man asking hello in a really obnoxious way behind me, I set my phone to record a video and tried my best to record him without him realizing. As I carried on walking down the path, he kept asking me, "Hello, are you deaf or something?" I had my phone recording, and I said that I didn't want to talk to him. The fellow was easily in his 50s. I realized that he was probably feeling quite brave on account of the half-empty bottle of vodka he was carrying with him. As I actually listened to him talk, it was like talking to a child. I told him I wanted him to leave me alone, and he asked me why. I told him I just didn't want to be around him, and he shouldn't be following people he doesn't know through the park. He said there was nothing wrong with walking with someone, and that he just wanted to be my friend. He carried on like that, being completely pig-headed and irritating. He didn't escalate, though, so I just kept walking until we were only a few feet away from the exit of the park. The street I live on was just on the other side. There's a set of those anti-cycle gates near the end, so I had to slow my pace a bit to walk through. As I did, he suddenly asked me, "Okay, well, can I have a hug then?" Obviously, I said, "No, you bloody well cannot have a hug. Are you mental or something?" I know it probably wasn't the smartest move to antagonize the guy, but I was furious he'd even have the cheek to ask a stranger that in the first place. I was so outraged that I stopped as I was about halfway through the cycle gate, but I think that's exactly what he wanted. He reached out and grabbed the arm of my coat. I tried to pull away from him, but he stepped forward closer to the gate and managed to get a firm grip on my arm. I remember looking around really fast to see if there was anyone I could call over for help. When I didn't see anyone, that anger I felt turned to fear. I tried to yell at him to get off of me, but my voice broke up as I felt a lump forming in my throat. I didn't think I'd get so scared so quickly. I suppose feeling it hit me all at once. It was just a little too much. When I pulled my arm away as hard as I could, I expected him to look angry or something, but he didn't. He looked like he was having the time of his life, with a big goofy grin on his face, like he was having a lot of fun to see me so frightened. That only made me more afraid that he was going to do something even worse. I kept moving to the cycle gate after shouting at him to leave me alone. I didn't look back, and I was not sure if he was still following me. All I could think to do was keep walking at an even faster pace and hope I ran into someone that I could ask to help me. As I turned the corner, there was a man in his yard, about half a football pitch down the street, tending to his front garden. I remember running towards him, hoping I still wasn't being followed. I really wished I'd chosen some flatter shoes. He saw me before I got close, and I guess he could see what a state I was in, because he stopped and walked over to me, asking me if I was okay. I looked behind me one last time, and felt a wave of relief as I saw the man who had been following me was gone. I'd somehow managed to keep it together until that moment, but when I realized I was safe now, the dam just burst. I ended up bursting into tears as I asked this gardener man to call the guards, which is what we call the police here, by the way. I saw that same guy again the other day when I was walking home. The guards said they'd given him a talking to about approaching young woman when it's unwelcome. He was sat there in the exact same spot like last time, like he was just waiting for me to walk past again. I walk home a different route now. I'd rather be safe and get home later than risk walking past that bastard again. I just don't know why some guys have to be like that. This happened a few years ago while I was living in Florida. I'm a female and around 20 years old, and had been going through a pretty rough patch in my life. I had the great idea to take a few tabs of LSD and go to St. Augustine for a day trip to take my mind off everything. St. Augustine is notorious for being insanely haunted, but it's one of my favorite places to go. I went by myself and made the 3-hour drive. This wasn't out of the ordinary for me. I often went on adventures like this all by myself, and I always had a great time. I went to the historic downtown and spent my peak looking around at all the cool shops, even made one hell of a walk to the lighthouse, passing by tons of tourists and people going on about their day. When you're tripping balls, it walks the fine line of exciting and terrifying, and I loved that feeling. As I started coming down, I went back to my car and decided to go to the beach. There was still a solid 2 hours of daylight left, and I thought being on the beach during the sunset would be amazing. I found some random pull-off area that you had to drive down a mile or so before you hit the parking lot. Not one other car was in it, which was welcomed after being amongst crowds all day. This lot was a giant circle, surrounded by trees and marshy land. Off to the side was a boardwalk that you could walk quite a few ways down to get to the beach. Once I finally got to the sand, I left my shoes by the boardwalk so I could find where it was when I came back. I was still not completely in my right mind by any means. The entrance was also pretty well hidden. I then walked for a solid 45 minutes down the beach. I found a nice spot with a big washed-up log where I could put my bag and clothes while I went for a swim. While I was in the water, I started getting to myself, thinking about all the stories about how extremely haunted the beach truly was. Not long after that, I had a very intense burning at my side. Think if you get a severe scratch or cut and put rubbing alcohol on it. Immediately, my high ass got to thinking that a ghost had just tried to drag me into the depths or something. I got out of the water as quick as possible, and upon closer inspection, I realized it was a jellyfish sting. I laughed it off. The sun was going down quickly, and I remembered I had quite a trek back to my car. The jellyfish sting was a huge damper on my mood. I grabbed up everything, and by the time I made it to the boardwalk again, it was dusk. The boardwalk was probably a half-mile walk back to my car. I had barely started walking down it when I heard someone talking. A few seconds later, I came across a dirty-looking man talking to himself and swinging a huge machete at random plants off to the side. I froze in my tracks, not knowing what the hell to do or what was going on here. He was slowly walking in the direction I was, so I decided to try and keep pace with him and follow behind as quietly as possible. This went on for about 5 minutes. When he stopped, I froze in place, not knowing what to do. I decided to just walk by. As quickly and calmly as possible, I hoped he wouldn't say anything to me and would just keep swinging his machete at the plants around him. As soon as I passed him by, though, I heard him say something to me. He must have been on something too, because I couldn't understand what he was saying. I didn't look back, and I didn't say anything at all. I just kept walking. I heard his footsteps start to follow behind me. I picked up the pace, hoping he would lose interest. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. I heard him right behind me, following me a few feet behind. Every once in a while, he'd say something, but I ignored him and didn't look back. I was convinced that if I looked back at him, he would attack me with that machete, and it would all be over. He started saying things to me more frequently, but I refused to look back or respond in any way. He was becoming angry that I wouldn't acknowledge him and began shouting. I felt the wind from the machete swing right behind me, and I started to full-on run. At that point, I knew the parking lot wasn't too far away. I figured my heightened senses would easily allow me to outrun him. To my horror, he began chasing me. It was completely dark outside now, and my adrenaline was in full force. I finally made it to the lot and somehow got my keys out of my bag in record time. I jumped in my car and floored it out of there. As I was coming out, I saw him standing off to the side of the road. He was screaming something and angrily swinging his machete around. He tried to charge towards my car, but I honked the horn and drove past him, flying down the road and away from this maniac. My friends had always warned me against these little adventures, as I was a young and fairly good-looking woman. It was a running joke that I'd get murdered one day while out by myself, and that experience made me realize just how real that possibility could actually be. I used to waitress, and after closing, the wait staff would meet at a 24-hour restaurant/motel for breakfast. As I was waiting for everyone else to arrive, I noticed a creepy man drinking a milkshake at the counter. I thought it was a bit strange because it was in the middle of winter. Around this time, there was a lot of talk of working girls going missing. I waitress at the Gentlemen's Club, and it was maybe a 2-minute walk away from the restaurant/motel. It was in less of a desirable neighborhood, to say the least. Because of the transient nature of that line of work, the missing girls were mostly just rumors. As it was a tourist town, stuff like that never made the papers. Anyway, I was sitting in the restaurant and getting major creepy vibes from this guy. People started arriving, and we began chatting about our previous night. The man was still sitting there, but I was able to ignore it and kind of forget about my strange feeling. And I felt a little bit bad about judging the guy without knowing anything about him. After I finished my meal, I went out for a smoke all alone. This is around the time my area started tightening up on smoking laws, so you were no longer allowed to smoke on patios with awnings. This meant I had to walk to the end of the patio adjacent to the dark and almost empty parking lot. Right by where I was smoking, there was a car with American plates. Not unusual in and of itself, but as I was looking at the SUV, the creepy milkshake man came out of the restaurant. I quickly put two and two together that this car must be his. He started talking to me, saying some weird things. Needless to say, he got my attention very quickly. I figured since you were giving me the cold shoulder, I'd come stand out in the cold. As he was talking to me, he made unwavering eye contact. His head was hung slightly low, and he was glancing at me from under his eyebrows, if that makes any sense. Something about him just seemed very predatory. My alarm bells were ringing. As he was talking, he slowly started walking toward me, with his hands in his pockets. He never broke eye contact with me. I'd heard people talk about predatory stares and the face of evil. If I had any doubt at all about his intentions, the way he was looking at me told me everything I needed to know. His eyes were filled with hate. That's the only way I can describe it. He continued advancing toward me, and now I was stuck between this man and the trunk of his SUV. He was less than a foot away from me, and my back was literally against the wall. It became clear that he was going to try and do something to me. His hands were still in his pockets. I didn't know if he had a knife or a stun gun or what, but I knew I didn't want to find out. It became clear to me I would have to fight him off. As I was preparing to knee him in the balls, he was barely an arm's length away. I could hear footsteps around us. See, the motel is above the restaurant, with concrete steps leading down to the patio and entrance. The second he heard someone coming, he ripped his hands out of his pockets and took a giant step away from me. I flicked my cigarette and ran inside to hurriedly tell all the dining bouncers the TLDR version of what just happened. It took me around 30 seconds or so. Max ran outside, but the man was already long gone. If I had any doubt about his intentions at all, his reaction to someone else being around us negated any doubt. You cannot convince me I would not have been murdered or worse, and I felt it in my bones. I was around 3 years old at the time. My father was a rancher, and he had found some random hunters on his property. He asked them to leave. As he was driving away, they opened fire on us. He always carried a handgun on him for badgers or coyotes, so he pulled it out and fired back while driving away. He actually landed a lucky shot and killed one of them. The other one was picked up by the sheriff an hour or so later. What leaves me in awe of my dad is that the first shot actually hit him right in the neck. Luckily, it was only a .22. There my dad was, with me, a 3-year-old child with him, struck in the neck by a bullet, but he still managed to very quickly return a few shots and drive away. He made it to the closest neighbors and waited for an ambulance to arrive. Luckily, he ended up living, and he's fine, though he has a very nasty scar on his neck. He rarely talks about the story, and I only know any of the details because my mom told me. Luckily, the courts found my father in self-defense of himself and me. The second guy got 30 years or so in prison. I remember my neighbor had to kill a local mafia guy in self-defense. This was in the 90s. It turned my neighbor into a real mental wreck. He was an honest, hard-working guy who had never hurt anyone. The family had to move for obvious reasons, but I got the story from my dad, who was a friend of his during those years. Mafia guy wanted to buy my neighbor's home from him to expand their hotel. They offered a generous amount, but my neighbor and his wife weren't really interested in moving. They had roots in the neighborhood and a kid going to school as well, plus extended family in the area. The guy just kept harassing my neighbor, though, for weeks and weeks, until he threatened to beat him to death and rape his wife the next time he came. Well, the next time the mafia guy visited my neighbor, the neighbor had called the police about the previous incident and filed for a restraining order. The mafia guy clearly didn't care about going to jail. He pulled a gun on my neighbor. That's when my neighbor wrestled him to the ground and beat the shit out of him, then killed him by strangling him. The experience really affected not just him, but his extended family as well, who also had to completely relocate after the incident. Yeah, pretty crazy, huh? My father's family home lies deep in the mountains of Kyushu. We're talking a little step up from what most consider to be the countryside, or even the middle of nowhere. We got a call from my aunt one evening, and we found out that my aunt, who lived in the house my father grew up in, had planned some renovations. She said there might be some old books and manga from the early Shah period, which I could have if I wanted. By the way, the Shah period would have been from about 1926 to 1936. Therefore, the books and manga might have well been worth something, or they would have at least been kind of rare. I was more than interested in checking out these books. I was a teenager, male by the way if that matters at all, and was developing an interest in history and literature. My father and I headed over there to help my aunt out. It was the first time I'd been over in 5 or 6 years, and along with my dad and I heard my cousin was heading over as well. It would have been the first time I'd seen him ever since my grandparents passed on about 10 years ago. When we arrived, we were greeted by my aunt, who literally came rushing out to our car. I guess she was very excited to see us. It seemed a little bit much. After we all said our hellos and dispensed with the small talk, she revealed to me the reason why she was so excited. She said she had found something interesting, that behind the Buddhist altar that no one had ever thought to move was, in her words, an unopened room. Well, to a boy my age, that was just about the most interesting thing I had ever heard. I wanted to see that room and what was inside. The very idea of a secret room sent me and my cousin wild. I asked my dad if he knew anything about this, and he said that he didn't. The Buddhist altar in the house was so big that it covered the wall from floor to ceiling. We all went straight inside to go and see what my aunt had discovered. The altar was sort of built into the walls, so there could have been no access at all to that room for my grandparents. What was the purpose of it then? It was so weird. No one had a clue, and we couldn't even come up with a guess. Before renovations began, I had to know what was in that room. We all couldn't resist the mystery of what might be behind the door. There were some weird etchings and markings on the door, some symbols and signs from times gone by. We pushed on, and with a creak, the door opened. We weren't ready for what we saw. There was a small, weird display, like a cabinet or something. Inside was a small skeleton, which had been dressed in a kimono. That sent everyone into an uproar. We called someone out and had the bones examined by the police. The short story with the bones is that thankfully they did not belong to a human being. The examiner thought it could have been the bones of a primate, likely a monkey. It's completely unknown as to why there was a secret room behind the altar that had that skeleton in it, and why they dressed it up in a kimono. I really have no clue, and that's why I'm here. I'm asking if anyone knows any reason why someone would do this, or if anyone has found something similar. I know it's a long shot, and a lot of you will likely think my grandparents are mad or something, but trust me, they weren't. They were always so nice and kind. Seeing that secret really freaked me out. I'm optimistically hoping there might be a good reason behind it. We also found numerous boxes in there with various things inside. I found some disturbing things, such as a mummified finger. What the hell was that? Someone, anyone, please tell me. I used to work at a Target department store as a cashier. I worked there for almost 6 months, but ended up quitting. The scariest thing that happened was one random night when I was working the night shift. I don't remember what time I started or exactly when I got off either, but I was working as cashier and helping countless customers. The store was decently busy, and there were a steady amount of people at my register. I remember toward the end of my shift, this guy with a big beard came into my line. I don't recall what he bought exactly, and we had a pretty normal interaction. I don't remember anything out of the ordinary at all. I remembered him just because of his very big and memorable beard. Anyway, he walked away, and then I helped the next person in line behind him. Probably 10 minutes or so after this, it was time for my final break of the night. I turned off the light to my checkout lane and helped the final customer, then left. I walked to the front of the store and went down a quiet hallway to where our break room was. The break room had several tables, chairs, a refrigerator, and a TV. I sat down at the table and was the only person inside the entire break room at that time. I went on my phone like usual and caught up in messaging my friends and whatnot. About 5 minutes later, I saw somebody else come into the break room out of the corner of my eye. I didn't really pay attention to them though. The person walked over and sat down right next to me at the table. When I looked up, I was surprised to see it was the same bearded man from just a few minutes before. I was so confused as to what he was doing here. He didn't work at Target, so why would he be in the break room with me? The man told me I had to go with him. I was asking him what the hell he was talking about. He said we should go right now and was pointing toward the exit. There was an employee's entrance down the hallway from the break room. I asked the guy who he was, and he said he would tell me later. The man stood up and said once more to leave with him now. Obviously, this seemed crazy to me. I had no intentions of doing so. He grabbed my arm and started to try to get me to stand up as well. I stood, but I resisted, and I tried to get away from him. When this happened, I suddenly heard the door open from behind. I looked back and saw one of my coworkers, Brian, entering the break room. He looked very confused by what he was seeing. I remember that the man tried pulling my arm to get me to go with him again, but I was still resisting. That's when Brian asked what was going on. The man finally let go of my arm and then ran away toward the employee's exit. I went over to Brian and told him the whole story. I said I was so happy he walked in when he did. Looking back, I don't know what would have happened if he didn't. Brian went to see if the guy had left, and he did. Another coworker came into the break room a short time later, and we all talked about what happened. After that, I went back to work and finished up my shift. For the next several days, everything was fine. I worked one other time without any kinds of problems. I remember that my next shift after that, I was working at night again. Things had been going by like normal. I had a few customers in my checkout line. It was probably 9 o'clock or so. I remembered that I casually looked up and suddenly saw the same bearded man in line. He didn't have any items with him, and I had a really bad feeling about this. When it was his turn, I told him I was going to call the police if I ever saw him again. The man laughed a little and said he would be waiting for me when I got off. Then he just walked away and left. I went straight for my manager after that and told her about what happened. We decided to call the police. They came out quite quickly, and when we spoke to them about the situation, they went into the parking lot. They actually found the man out there, waiting near my vehicle. It gave me the creeps when I heard that. I'm really glad we called the police. I ended up getting a restraining order against the guy, and I haven't seen him since then. I saw the most messed up thing I ever saw in my life at the York Commons Walmart in Dayton, Ohio. I was near the pharmacy section, not in it exactly, but in one of the aisles where I could see it. That was when some guy walked past me, who smelled like a dead skunk. I didn't recognize where it was coming from at first. Like he walked past me and suddenly I smelled this god-awful stench. I started to look around to see where it was coming from. I figured the guy might have farted as he walked past me, which wasn't anything to start a fight with him over. But still, who the hell even does that? Then, as I was looking at him, I thought, Jesus Christ, dude, eat a salad every once in a while. I started to notice he was not exactly very well put together. I hate to sound like an insensitive jerk here, but he had the distinct air of homelessness about him, and so, at pure morbid curiosity, I decided to stay put and see what this guy was up to. I'm not particularly proud of myself for feeling that urge, and now that I'm typing it out, it's really hitting me how weird that behavior is. It's the same kind of feeling that makes people stare at car accidents, I guess. Anyway, I just watched as the homeless-looking guy waited in line to talk to the pharmacist. The person in front of him clearly started to smell him too, because she turned around and gave him this look that said, "Take a bath already." She grabbed her pills or whatever and stepped away. Then the stinky homeless man stepped up to the counter to ask for whatever he needed. I could never have guessed how horrifying the situation actually was. It was horrifying. I was watching the homeless-looking man talking to the pharmacist, whose eyes were watering because of how close he was. I couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but the dude seemed like he was asking the pharmacist some questions, and the pharmacist couldn't exactly understand him. The very next thing I know, the guy was leaning down, grabbing a hold of his pants leg and rolling it up real carefully, all the way to the boot and past his sock. The pharmacist leaned over the counter. That was from what I'm guessing was a slightly raised platform on the other side. When the homeless man pulled his pant leg up a little more and reached the flesh, both me and the doctor pulled back in horror. I was 10 to 15 feet away, so I couldn't really see the guy's leg well. Even from that distance, though, I could tell the color of his leg was seriously wrong. There was something going on down there, and that's when it hit me. The bad smell wasn't coming from the guy's mouth or armpits or something. It was coming from this grievous leg wound. It was so badly infected it must have been rotting from the inside out. I remember the pharmacist covering his mouth after seeing it. I had never seen them gag or anything, but it looked as close as possible. He told the guy in a higher volume, not even talking to him in a polite way, giving him a dire order that he needed to go to the hospital right now. The homeless dude kept saying that he didn't know if that was true. The pharmacist's eyes went wide as he repeated himself again. "Sir, listen to me. You need to go to the hospital right now. This is very serious." I couldn't stand by at this point. I was very aware I was watching this unfold, and being one of those insensitive jerks who stares at the 4-car pileup and doesn't offer to help or anything. I walked over and did the only thing I could think of. I asked the homeless man if he wanted me to call him an ambulance so he could get some actual medical assistance for his leg. He kept insisting that he didn't need it, but the pharmacist spoke again. "Sir, you need it right now or you're gonna die." I remember reaching into my pants pocket to get my phone and looking down at its screen. That's when I caught a glance of this dude's leg up close. It was so rotten I'm pretty sure I could see his shin bone directly. There was some kind of muscle membrane or something as well. As I was looking at it, I really started to smell it again. It was so bad I had to cover my mouth and nose with my shirt to stop myself from gagging. The man kept insisting that we please not call anyone, but I totally ignored him. I don't know if he had outstanding warrants or didn't have enough money or what, but there was no way in hell I was going to walk out of that Walmart and leave that guy standing there like that. I felt really guilty for my first thoughts being that he was a stinky jerk, then realizing that the man might be dying right in front of my eyes. In the end, he stopped protesting and walked out. The pharmacist and I were calling after him. "Hey, you can't just leave!" But he did. He walked out like he was fine, but he was definitely not fine. According to the pharmacist, it was a miracle he was even on his feet at all. He had to be on some serious painkillers or have a real addiction and be numb to all that pain, because a regular person would be screaming in agony. The pharmacist said the guy would probably die soon if he didn't get to a hospital as fast as possible. A part of me wants to hope that he did, but I just kind of know that he probably didn't. Unfortunately, it was probably just one of those homeless guys that dies, disappears, and doesn't even get so much as a funeral to mark their passing. And that's really kind of sad. This happened to me when I was 23. One night I went to a restaurant in the city. I'm not saying which one or which city for privacy reasons, but it was a restaurant that had a bar in it as well. On this particular night, I had ordered my food and soda. I didn't order any alcoholic beverages, as I was going to drive myself home afterwards. Anyway, after my food arrived, just as I was about to start eating, there was an older man one table over, just kind of staring at me. He smiled and looked away, and I didn't really think too much of it. I started eating my food, but when I'd eaten about half and finished some of my drink, I excused myself to go to the restroom. After I left the restroom, I went back to the table, and that same guy at the one table over from me was staring at me yet again. He did it for a few seconds longer this time. I was starting to get really creeped out, so I just went back to eating my food. When I went to take a drink of my soda though, it tasted really weird. I don't know how to describe it really. I shrugged it off and drank the small amount left, then paid and got out. When I got to my car, my stomach immediately started feeling funny. It wasn't hurting exactly. It was just a strange feeling I can't really describe. I didn't really pay much attention to it. I drove myself home and got back at about 10 p.m. When I got back to my house and went inside, I started to feel a really sharp pain in my stomach. I went and sat down on the couch, and after about a minute or so, the pain had started to settle. 5 minutes later, it started up again, only this time hurting far worse. It seriously hurt so bad that I began sobbing. I thought I must have ate something bad at the restaurant. The pain settled again after about a minute. Then 15 minutes later, I started to feel another feeling in my stomach. I went to the bathroom just in case something bad was about to happen. It was right then that I actually started to feel really sick. I leaned over the toilet and began vomiting profusely. I was puking my guts out, and doing it so much I was throwing up like the possessed girl from The Exorcist. I got down on my knees, and my stomach really started hurting. At first, I thought it was just food poisoning, like I said earlier, but every time I tried to move at all, my stomach started to hurt even worse. I pulled my phone out of my pants pocket and called 911. I told them what was going on, and they arrived in about 5 minutes. I told the paramedics everything and how my stomach really hurt whenever I tried to move. They actually had to strap me to a gurney to take me out into the hospital. Once we arrived, I had told the doctor and nurse everything as well. I even told them what time I was at the restaurant and everything else. They said they'd call them up and explain things to them. A little while they came back, and they were explaining that I was not throwing up because of food poisoning, but because someone had poisoned my drink. They told me that apparently the restaurant manager had looked at the security cameras and saw a guy put something inside my drink while I was away. They described him as the exact same guy at the restaurant who had been staring at me previously. Needless to say, I was shocked. I never thought something like this would happen to me. I spent the whole night in the hospital for observation. The next morning, the police came into my room and told me the restaurant manager had showed them the camera footage. They said they were able to catch the guy, and he was arrested. The police asked if I wanted to press charges, and of course I told them yes. Later that afternoon, I got to head home. The police were actually the ones who drove me home later that night. It took some time, but he ended up being sentenced for quite a while in jail. That, on top of additional charges that he was wanted for. It wasn't like he'd tried to spike my drink to have sex with me or anything. He'd actually tried to kill me. for no reason. So to that guy who tried to spike my drink and kill me that night, fuck you. I really hope you learn your lesson in jail. But yeah, I don't think I'll forget about that night for as long as I live. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.